All right, welcome everyone to the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics 2025 Spring Speaker Series. I'm Todd Haw, Associate Professor of Business Law and Ethics at the Kelley School and the Faculty Director of the ICGE. And I'm thrilled to be joined today with our moderator, Matt Turk, who will introduce our speaker, Andrew Jennings, and his talk, Four Strange Things About Corporate Criminals, in just a moment. But before I turn things over to Matt, I'd like to say just a quick word about the ICGE and its sister institute, Ethical Systems. The Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics was relaunched earlier this year with the aim of taking a broader, more interdisciplinary, and more systems-based approach to corporate governance and ethics research. So not only did we want to ensure that we were considering corporate governance in its full scope, including the research areas of corporate law, corporate compliance, business and behavioral ethics, finance management, and financial controls, but we also wanted to make sure that that research was more accessible to business practitioners. So as part of that relaunch, the ICGE brought Ethical Systems to the Kelley School from NYU Stern, which doubled the number of our faculty affiliates and created an entirely new network of collaborators under the ICGE umbrella, as well as a new platform to reach business leaders. So bringing the ICGE and Ethical Systems together has created a one-of-a-kind institution that is able to harness the best academic research to aid scholars, policymakers, and business leaders, current and future, so that includes students, in elevating corporate governance and ethical business practices within their companies. And this speaker series is just one of the ways that we're doing that. Another is our first roundtable conference that will be taking place at the end of April in Indianapolis, which will bring together academic and industry leaders to learn from one another, centered around the topics of governance, risk, and compliance. So please check out our websites and social media for all these initiatives and more that's coming from the ICGE and Ethical Systems. And now let me introduce our moderator for today's talk, my colleague and ICGE Research Director, Matt Turk. So Matt is an associate professor of business law and ethics, whose scholarship focuses on financial regulation, securities law, and international economic law. His work has been published in a number of top journals, including Northwestern, Iowa, Georgia, Alabama, and Washington and Lee law journals, among others. Before joining the Kelley School, Matt served as a federal law clerk on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for the Honorable Ferdinand Fernandez and as a corporate litigator at Sullivan and Cromwell. He is a magna cum laude graduate of NYU Law School, where he was an editor for the Journal of International Law and Politics. Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Todd, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I have the pleasure today of introducing our speaker, Professor Andrew Jennings, who will be talking with us about white-collar corporate crime. Andrew is an associate professor of law at Emory Law School. He earned a JD from Duke University School of Law, where he served as editor of the Duke Law Journal, and he also has a master's in economics from Duke University. Prior to joining the law school at Emory, Andrew was an assistant professor at Brooklyn Law School, a lecturer in law and teaching fellow for the Corporate Governance and Practice program at Stanford Law School, and a scholar in residence at Duke Law School. He served as a law clerk to the Honorable Helene N. White of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. He previously practiced law at Cravath, Swaine & Moore, LLP, where he handled mergers and acquisitions and corporate governance matters. And he also practiced law at Sullivan & Cromwell, LLP, where he practiced in criminal defense and investigations. In addition to his scholarship and teaching, Professor Jennings has served as an expert witness in business-related litigation and is the creator and host of the Business Scholarship Podcast, which features interviews with legal, accounting, finance, and other scholars. Before I turn it over to Andrew, I would like to invite you all to share your questions in the Q&A. I will monitor that, and we will be sure to pause throughout the presentation for questions. With that, I will turn it over to you, Andrew.
All right. Thank you, Matt, and thank you to Todd and ICGE for inviting me to speak today about four strange things about corporate criminals. Over the last few years, my research agenda has spent a lot of time and a number of papers looking at odd distortions that occur when corporate law and criminal law intersect. So my four strange things about corporate criminals today will be some quick synopses of some of the papers that I've written in recent years that will go into some high-level detail, but I hope by the end of this conversation, I've convinced you that there are some, in fact, strange distortions when these two fields intersect, which might cause us to think about how we want to approach the problem of corporate criminal law in general, and perhaps even whether there should be corporate criminal law at all. Before I begin talking about some of the strange things, the four strange things for today's conversation, I'd like to start with just a quick overview of corporate criminal law. This is sort of a strange concept to a lot of people. We generally think about criminal law violations as being something that is bound up with morality, with personal volition, with the sense that somebody who acts in a criminal way is one who acts with a guilty or criminal mind. And of course, these typical conceptions of criminal law don't really fit that well when we're talking about corporations, other business entities. In many ways, the concept of corporate criminal law finds some similarities in the medieval laws of deodand or frank pledge. Deodand is the idea that we're going to hold inanimate objects or animals criminally responsible for some wrongful conduct. This is kicking the chair that trips you. It's somewhat of a strange idea after all, because of course, inanimate objects and animals lack any sort of moral volition to engage in misconduct. The idea of frank pledge says that we're going to hold a community of people jointly responsible, collectively responsible for the criminal acts of one. We can think about corporate criminal crime as being either a law of deodand or a law of frank pledge. We're going to hold an artificial person responsible for breaking the law, even though it has no volition of its own. Or we're going to hold a community of people who are pulled together in the corporate form as employees, shareholders, etc., collectively responsible for the criminal offenses of one person within that community. So what is the legal basis for corporate criminal liability, at least in the United States today? Well, in the United States, we have a fairly promiscuous doctrine of respondeat superior liability. You'll also hear me call it vicarious liability today, in which if an employee or agent of a corporation commits a criminal offense in the context of his or her employment with some intent, no matter how slight, to benefit the company itself will be vicariously liable for that criminal offense. So if I'm working at a company and I pay a bribe to somebody to get business, well, I've committed the act of bribery. I'm responsible for that. But my employer is also equally responsible for the crime of bribery. Now, this requires us to draw a distinction between de jure corporate criminal liability and de facto criminal liability. De jure is just what I talked about. It's respondeat superior liability. An employee commits a crime, therefore the employer has also committed a crime. As a practical matter, though, prosecutors have discretion in what cases they want to bring. We know that not all crimes are actually policed against. Certainly that's true in the corporate context as well. Prosecutors will have various goals that they need to consider in deciding whether or not to bring a case against a corporation, and if so, whether to settle that case or maybe in extreme circumstances, take that case to conviction. Some of those interests, and we'll talk about some of them in more depth today, include punishing a corporate offender for misconduct, imposing non-punitive consequences. For example, maybe we need to incapacitate a corporate offender from a particular line of business to prevent it from engaging in misconduct in the future. Perhaps we want to engage in corporate prosecution or enforcement in the criminal space to obtain general deterrence against other firms engaging in the same behavior, or specific deterrence against the same firm engaging in recidivist behavior. Perhaps we want to use the corporate criminal system to encourage firms to reform themselves, to fix whatever the root causes of their violations of law were. Or perhaps we want to use corporate criminal enforcement to identify and pursue the individuals within a firm who gave rise to the firm's culpability. Because after all, individuals actually do have volition. They actually do decide to engage in misconduct in the corporate setting. Now, in the background for today's talk is what I call the prosecutor's dilemma. which is collateral consequences. Collateral consequences exist in the individual prosecution space as well. They are often not at the forefront of prosecutors' considerations in what to do with individual offenders. In the corporate context, however, collateral consequences are really driving the bus. Concerns, for example, about if we impose a particularly large fine on a corporation, maybe it won't be able to stay in business. Maybe there will be layoffs. We don't want layoffs. Maybe it will lose valuable licenses that it needs to operate. We don't want companies to go out of business for loss of licensure. Maybe it'll be unable to compete in certain contract markets. We don't want to hamstring these engines of economic activity, or at least this is the dilemma that prosecutors face when they're deciding how to deal with a corporate criminal. This leads us to a set of practices around corporate crime that is a classic carrot versus stick approach. The stick is, all right, you corporation, you're vicariously liable for the conduct of your employees. We can essentially force you into conviction because you don't have much of a defense if your employee is him or herself liable. And we can impose pretty big fines on you and other consequences. Or we can follow the carrot approach, which is to say, all right, help us help you, corporate America. If you maintain an effective corporate compliance program ex ante, even if it doesn't totally prevent all violations of law, we're going to give you some credit. If you self-report to us when you discover that there are violations of law in your midst, we're going to give you some credit. If you cooperate in our investigation of you, we're going to give you some credit. And if you undertake to remediate whatever the problems were that we think caused the violations in the first place, we're going to give you some credit. And importantly, the credit is going to take really two forms. One, a huge reduction in the fine that a corporation might otherwise have to pay. A corporate criminal can't go to jail after all, so a fine is as close as we can really get in terms of punishment. And then two, you'll avoid conviction. We will enter into a settlement agreement with you that will stop short of you being convicted of a crime corporation. Okay, so this background leads us to our first strange thing about corporate criminals, which is that corporate criminals can sell their crimes. Now, we typically don't think about crime as being something that can transfer from person to person, but in the corporate context, it can. This strange thing is based on a 2023 paper that I wrote, The Market for Corporate Criminals. Let me give you an overview. I open with a motivating example of a company called Bankrate. Bankrate.com, you can go to it right now if you'd like. Not right now, but maybe after the talk. It used to be a publicly traded company. In the early 2010s, the CFO of Bankrate was engaged in a form of accounting fraud called cookie jar accounting. That accounting fraud had the effect of deceiving investors. So the accounting fraud was really a securities fraud. The SEC and the Department of Justice found out about this. The CFO went to prison for securities fraud. And while these agencies were investigating the fraud at Bankrate, keep in mind, Bankrate was on the hook for its CEO or its CFO's conduct. He was committing accounting fraud in the context of his job as CFO. A company called Red Ventures came along and acquired Bankrate for over $1 billion, pretty big amount. All right, well, during this time, we see Red Ventures acquire Bankrate, and a few months later, it enters into a settlement agreement with the Department of Justice that says, among other things, that the acquirer here, Red Ventures, is responsible under US law for the criminal activity that happened at Bankrate, criminal activity that occurred well before Red Ventures entered into the picture. How could this be? How could the criminal liability of Bankrate transfer to Red Ventures? Well, this is pretty unremarkable in the context of corporate crime. It would be quite shocking in the context of individuals, but in the corporate context, it's really just a function of two doctrines. The first is the respondeat superior liability doctrine that I talked about at the beginning of the hour. And then the second is successor liability doctrine, which is to say, in M&A, if you acquire a company with some differentiation based on the structure that you choose for that acquisition, you're going to be on the hook for the liabilities of the company that you acquire. Now, ordinarily, that's going to include things like you're going to be on the hook for contract or tort claims, but it can also include that you're going to be on the hook for criminal claims, criminal liability. So in the paper, I argue that this suggests that there might be a market for corporate criminals that takes on three forms. There's a market for unknown offenders. That is to say, I acquire a company and I don't know that there is some criminal liability, some criminal history lurking in the target company's past that could rear its head conceivably in the future. I'm taking on a pretty scary liability when I do that. There's a market for known offenders. That's the Bankrate case. Red Ventures knew about the issues at Bankrate. It could plan for what it thought the resolution to those issues might be. And then there's a market for probationers. These are companies that have already settled with prosecutors. They are maybe under some ongoing obligations as part of a settlement agreement. But when you acquire that company, perhaps you have a little bit of a better view of what's going on and what you're taking on. Now, in the paper, I raised some concerns about successor liability in the criminal context as potentially imposing some social costs. On one hand, a fear of taking on successor liability in the criminal context, especially, could at the margin undermine M&A markets, which may or may not be a good or bad thing. It could also lead to foregone compliance opportunities. We could imagine that if a high compliance firm acquires a low compliance firm, the buyer could reform what's going on at the seller, could fix compliance issues at the seller. On the other side, however, there's a concept of misconduct synergies that I borrow from Yimfor and Tux in a recent article they've written about the broker-dealer industry, which suggests that we could see a world in which low compliance firms acquire low compliance sellers, and therefore we have violations of law at higher scales. And in the paper, I explain why misconduct synergies might occur in this market for corporate criminals. Now, this all butts against a prosecutor's dilemma. This is where I see some opportunity. A prosecutor, corporate prosecutor at least, probably doesn't want to impose full penalties on a corporate offender. Because although a corporate offender might be quite valuable as an overall aggregate, actually imposing full penalties on the firm might require us to break the cookie jar open. I'll illustrate. Let's say a company has a $3 billion valuation. Maybe it's engaged in some massive illegal activity, or its employees have. Maybe $500 million is the appropriate fine for that sort of activity. We can't really impose $500 million as a fine on that company, however, because if we do so, it doesn't actually have $500 million. It'd have to break itself up to afford such a thing. That might impose some collateral consequences that prosecutors would like to avoid. So in the paper, I look at the opportunity that this market for corporate criminals presents, and I suggest that you could negotiate corporate settlement agreements to impose a full penalty, but make that penalty contingent on future M&A, because M&A is the time when the company is at its most liquid. You can move and allocate value around at the deal table. And so I talk in the paper about how we could use M&A and this market for corporate criminals issue, perhaps to impose more appropriate penalties that will allow prosecutors and the public indirectly to force an internalization of the cost of corporate crime onto internal stakeholders, especially shareholders. So we'll talk about the innocence of shareholders in a minute, but a run through for some of my work is to suggest that we should be reluctant to perhaps label shareholders as always blameless or innocent or victims in need of protection. And so I call for some approaches in the paper that I hope will foster a market for corporate criminals, a compliance enhancing market for corporate criminals, combined with the M&A contingent penalties I call for. I also suggest we offer amnesties to buyers. And actually, following the publication of this article, the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice updated some of its policies to incorporate some concepts around buyer amnesties, around criminal successor risk. So that at a high level is the first strange thing. Matt, do we have any questions from the audience?
No question, but we are going to pause after each of Andrew's strange things. So I encourage the viewers to submit questions mid-strange thing if they'd like to follow up with Andrew after each one of these topics. So Andrew, this is obviously a very interesting and provoking way to frame the issue. I had maybe a specific question about this misconduct synergies concept, which to me was very interesting. So you can raise your value in the M&A market as a firm if you engage in basically crime and you sell your company to another sympathetic criminal. How that sounds like a great that sounds interesting if you can pull it off. So my question is, how would a low compliance firm signal its propensity to commit crime in order to match with one of these buyers on the M&A market who also likes commit similar crimes and wants to team up?
You know, that's interesting. I don't know if they would necessarily that in the diligence materials and pitch deck for why we would be a good acquisition. We have a lot of skeletons in our closet, and we hear you do too. But that's interesting in that we often will call for greater transparency in the corporate enforcement space. So for example, Good Jobs First has a violation tracker that does a lot of granular tracking, and a lot of scholars use that data. You could imagine that maybe you're not advertising yourself as being a low compliance company. I can imagine lots of reasons why that might be problematic, but there's probably enough data out there to suggest to a potential buyer that, hey, they've got problems, we've got problems, prosecutors have this dilemma, they're probably not going to fully enforce against either of us. So if we combine, we might get some synergies there. So in the context of the Yeam4 and Tooks paper, they had excellent data because it was in the broker-dealer space where there's just a lot of disclosure around pretty granular misconduct. And that's public data that researchers can use or members of the public can use. And so I think to answer your question, the mechanism there would probably be observation by the buyer of violation history on the part of the seller. And there might be other sources as well. Litigation history, for example, would be disclosed in the diligence process. Other issues might send a signal to the buyer that, hey, there could be some misconduct synergies here.
Thank you. Appreciate the response. We have some questions trickling in, but I think I'll save them for the very end just to keep us on track. So feel free to submit more questions and we'll move on to strange thing number 2.
All right, strange thing number 2. Corporate criminals can force others to take the fall for them. They can force somebody else to take the blame. This strange thing is based on a 2024 paper, Criminal Subsidiaries. And it opens with The Wolf of Wall Street, a film I'm sure many people on today's webinar have seen, famously a movie about financial fraudsters. Perhaps appropriately, the financing for The Wolf of Wall Street came from financial fraud. Specifically, it came from a massive embezzlement against the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund, 1MDB. Pictured here is a man named Joe Law, who is one of the principals of this embezzlement. He's currently a fugitive from law. So if anybody should see him, there's probably a reward if you should call the FBI. But, you know, he pulled off a pretty big caper. He stole about $4.5 billion and used part of it to finance the Wolf of Wall Street. Now, it's hard to steal $4.5 billion. If I wanted some help with that, though, I would probably look to some of the best financial wizards out there. If I were going to steal $4.5 billion, I couldn't do worse than have Goldman Sachs help me out with that process. And indeed, Goldman Sachs, the parent company, several of its senior executives, and a number of Goldman Sachs, about half a dozen Goldman Sachs subsidiaries, were all implicated in the Joe Law embezzlement scandal and other associated criminal acts related to the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund. All right, well, Goldman, of course, found itself a subject of an investigation, as it often does. it reached a settlement with the government by which it would pay a huge financial settlement. And in return, neither Goldman Sachs, the parent company, nor any of its subsidiaries would be convicted of the criminal activities that they engaged in when they were helping facilitate the 1MDB scandal, except for one subsidiary. Goldman agreed that its Malaysian subsidiary would plead guilty to the offenses that Goldman, the parent, and its other subsidiaries were exposed to. In essence, the Malaysian subsidiary is serving as a scapegoat. Goldman wanted to avoid a parent-level conviction because of all the collateral consequences, particularly for a large financial institution that might follow a criminal conviction for financial crimes. And it was willing to sacrifice its Malaysian subsidiary, which by this point probably didn't have a very good reputation in Malaysia after all. All right, well, how could we have such a system in which a corporate offender is pointing the finger at somebody else to take the fall? In this case, its subsidiary. Well, this follows back to some concepts around organizational law, some basic ideas around corporate law as serving an asset partitioning function. Within a corporate group, I can allocate what entities within a corporate group are going to have what assets and what liabilities. And as a result, I can protect different parts of my corporate group. If you're a large company like Goldman, you have 100, 200 subsidiaries or more. I can protect the various parts of the corporate group against the liabilities that others obtain. Now, we might think about asset partitioning as serving really useful roles in corporate law. They facilitate capital formation by limited liability, and they reduce monitoring and transaction costs for credit agreements. Magically, this sort of asset partitioning can be effectively achieved by ex-ante structuring. If I want to limit my group's liability exposure, I can structure its affairs ex-ante in a way to achieve that. And future creditors can't really stop me from doing so. It's kind of magical in that way. There are exceptions, of course. The veil-piercing exception is one of the key ones to the ability to achieve effective asset partitioning via ex-ante structuring. But for the most part, we can do that. Now, we might think, though, about asset partitioning as largely a function of private law. It's effective for partitioning against tort and contract and similar private claims. What about criminal entity partitioning? Well, in the paper, I make the case that when we're talking about criminal liability, that corporate borders are actually far more porous than they are in the context of private liability. There are a few reasons for this. One, respondent superior liability is fairly broad reaching. So if multiple entities within a corporate group are all participating in the same misconduct, there's going to be a lot of different lines of vicarious liability between them. The area of corporate criminal law is doctrinally underdeveloped. We don't have a whole lot of common law judge-made rules around the scope of corporate criminal liability, unlike we do in the case of private liabilities in the corporate context. And related to that point about doctrinal underdevelopment, we have a very plea and settlement-driven practice where the law of corporate criminal liability is largely generated by an interactive system of bargaining between corporate offenders and their lawyers and prosecutors. And the law develops through that bargaining process. As a result of the doctrinal underdevelopment, the expansiveness of respondeat superior liability, and the plea settlement-driven practice of corporate criminal law, prosecutors are always, or will often at least, have a pretty colorable claim that different constituents within a corporate group are exposed to criminal liability. So this leads to one of the key insights of the paper, that asset partitioning in the criminal context can't be achieved ex ante. It can only be achieved ex post through settlement between a parent company and a prosecutor. Goldman isn't the only example. I offer a number of examples of this sort of arrangement happening over the years in the paper, but we can only force one of the subsidiaries to become the scapegoat if we have the ex post consent of both the parent and the prosecutor. Now, it's easy to imagine why parent companies might like to avoid a parent level conviction, and they might like to avoid a conviction of some of their other subsidiaries and might be willing to accept a conviction of maybe a Picayune subsidiary. Why might prosecutors agree to this sort of scapegoating? Well, I would suggest that this is a system that allows prosecutors to balance competing interests between holding corporate offenders accountable. And we might think about, in the criminal legal system in general, accountability typically includes conviction, holding corporate criminals accountable through conviction, while also avoiding the potential collateral consequences associated with convicting, let's say, a parent company or a really important subsidiary. And so this approach allows us to obtain a conviction, to communicate to the public that this was wrongful, condemnable conduct that violates our laws, signified by the solemn occasion of a criminal conviction, while also avoiding all the consequences that attend that conviction. So I think that's why prosecutors might be open to these sorts of transactions. Now, of course, the parent company might prefer no conviction for any part of the company at all. Prosecutors might insist on some level of conviction, however. So it is an uneasy but practical balance between concerns around corporate accountability and collateral consequences of that accountability. So I'll pause there. Any questions, Matt?
Thank you, Andrew. So we have a couple questions, and I think maybe I'll synthesize them. It seems like viewers are concerned maybe with the proportionality issue that this partitioning practice can make, especially on the prosecutor's side. So on one hand, you reduce the collateral damages, but I think the question is that commensurate? Are the financial penalties commensurate with the cost of the social consequences of the crime? In other words, by partitioning the criminal liability, is the prosecutor not providing adequate deterrence, essentially watering down the penalties?
I think this speaks to a bigger question around what fine levels prosecutors set. There isn't a perfect example of what the right fine is. People can debate about what the right fine is, but let's assume for the moment that there is some fine that is just the appropriate penalty to impose for a given act of criminal offending. There probably is some level that is appropriate. Yet prosecutors discount down from that level. So as I was talking about in the last strange thing or in the intro, there are different ways that corporate criminals can help themselves through compliance programs, self-reporting, cooperation, remediation, and so forth. That's one way to earn a discount on your fine. We're kind of serving the public interest by doing those things, and that might be worth a discount. My concern, though, and I think I share it with some of your listeners or some of the listeners of this webinar, is that maybe some of the discounts that firms are getting is unearned because collateral consequences and the fear of them is driving prosecutorial decision-making to a great degree. So I think it's a problem for maybe this scapegoating issue, but it's a broader problem too. I suspect that in these cases where we have, I call them subsidiary-only convictions, when we have these SOCs, in other words, I suspect the overall fine is being set at a level that would have occurred without convicting a subsidiary. It's the fine that the parent company was always going to pay. But is that fine unnecessarily discounted because of concerns about the company's perhaps laying people off or perhaps hurting shareholders, et cetera? I think that's a concern that's going to kind of run through today. But I would agree with the questioners that might be something that's going on, that there are some discounts on a penalty that are earned through cooperation, through remediation, and there are others that are unearned and are sort of the result of holding innocent stakeholders up as a shield.
Thank you. Now we have more questions in the chat, but I'm going to hold off on those and try to circle back to the extent I can because we are 2 out of 4. So onward to number 3, Andrew.
All right, third strange thing. So as we all know, criminals will sometimes incriminate themselves, but if they're effective at their jobs, they're pretty good at not creating evidence that falls into the hands of prosecutors. So this is a skills issue. Unlike individual offenders, however, corporate criminals simply cannot resist incriminating themselves. This strange thing is based on another recent paper, Criminal Record Keeping, from last year. And it starts with a really simple premise. Business managers have to create and keep records for purposes of decision making. And their record keeping needs, both the production and the retention of records, is going to be a function of how complex their business is and how long are they running their business. Let me illustrate. If you've got some extra furniture around the house and you want to sell it, you can go into Facebook Marketplace and sell it, be done in a few days, collect the money and move on. You don't really need to keep any records of that. You sold some furniture in a one-off transaction, you got the money, you're not doing it anymore. No record keeping needs. If you start making some custom furniture or something though, and selling it, let's say on Etsy, this might be an ongoing business. Maybe it's just a side hustle, but it's an ongoing business. And you're going to need to retain some documents. You need to know how much you're spending on producing whatever the good might be, furniture or something like that, perhaps. You need to know if you're selling it at a profit. What are returns looking like? What are shipping costs looking like, et cetera? Because you want to run your business in a profitable way. And you can't commit everything that's happening to memory. You can't analyze everything that's happening in your Etsy business in your mind. So you need to keep some level of record keeping. Now let's scale up way more. Your Amazon. There are potentially trillions of decision points that you have to make about how to run your business. What are our prices? Where are we going to ship from? Where are we going to locate our warehouses? How many people are going to work at our warehouses? What's the array of our warehouse going to look like? You have to keep a lot of data to make decisions to effectively run a business the size and scale of Amazon. All right. Well, the same logic is going to apply in the case of a criminal business. I'm engaged in some criminal enterprise. I still have to keep and create records to allow me to manage my enterprise. But of course, unlike for the operators of some legitimate activity, this is pretty bad news for the managers of a criminal business. Because by creating records or by retaining records, evidencing my activities, I'm creating what we might also call evidence for police or prosecutors. I'm increasing the likelihood that I'm detected and punished for my activity. Now, in the paper, I situate this issue of criminal record keeping in the context of three criminal corporate settings. The first involves an illicit organization engaged in illicit activity. This is an organization whose entire purpose is crime. Everything it does is criminal. Every record it produces evidences some criminal activity. The classic example might be drugs, for example, a drug selling gang, a drug cartel, etc. Then we have licit organizations that engage in illicit activity. Let's say that I own a construction company, for example. That's perfectly legitimate. You can own a construction company. That's a lawful business. But let's say that I obtain business from my construction company by accepting or by paying bribes, rather. I pay bribes to the local mayor to get a contract to build something for a municipality. That's illicit activity occurring within an otherwise licit organization. And in the last example, let's call back to Bankrate. That was a lawful organization, Bankrate.com. You can go to it after this talk. Engaged in illicit activity. It was preparing financial statements, as it must do for its investors. But it was engaging in that illicit activity in an illicit way. It was cooking the books. It was engaged in accounting fraud. All right, well, this points to two related costs when it comes to record keeping: production cost and retention cost. There's a direct cost to producing records and retaining them. I have to have a system of accounting within my organization to create records, and that's a cost. I have to retain those records. maybe in a physical filing cabinet, maybe on an online storage platform, but that's a direct cost. That's true for any sort of organization. There are costs to creating and retaining business records. But for criminal organizations, there's also an indirect cost, which is to say, every time I produce a criminal record, I am increasing the likelihood that that record is discovered, and therefore I am exposed. And in retaining those records, either for a given amount of time or creating copies, I'm again increasing the indirect cost that manifests in the form of increasing my detection risk. So in the paper, I talk about the comparative production and retention costs in my 3 record-keeping settings. If I'm engaged in illicit activity in an illicit organization, my production costs are pretty high. Whenever I create a ledger of how many kilos of some sort of drug I've sold and who owes me money and who do I owe money to, creating that record does expose me to some risk of detection. My retention costs are pretty low, though, because if I want, I can conceal the records. I don't have to share them with a compliance department or an accounting department. I can destroy the records to prevent them from falling into the hands of law enforcement. So my retention costs are relatively low. However, if I'm engaged in illicit activity in any form, in illicit activity, my retention costs are going to be pretty high because perhaps the firm has internal controls or record-keeping policies that require that records evidencing my conduct be retained. It's hard for me to destroy those documents. It might be physically impossible for me to get to them. There might be copies in a compliance department or in an accounting department. So the risk of that document lingering around and eventually turning state's evidence is fairly high. However, production costs are going to vary a little bit. If I'm engaged in illicit activity in an illicit organization, let's say I want to get money to pay bribes. Well, I'm going to have to create some documentation to justify the expenditure for bribes. I can't call it bribes. I might call it a consulting agreement, but I'm going to have to produce some documentation that other people in the organization are likely to see, and therefore I'm more likely to be exposed. Perhaps that risk is a bit lower in the context of illicit activity done illicitly in a legitimate organization, because facially speaking, the activity I'm engaged in is totally lawful and looks legitimate, and maybe it is less obvious to other observers that I've actually engaged in the activity in an illicit way. If I'm the CFO and I cook the books, it might be hard for other people to identify the ways in which I've cooked the books or engaged in fraud. All right, so that is the third strange thing. Matt, do we have any questions about it?
We don't in the chat. I'd say let's move on to number 4, and then we can consolidate at the end.
All right,
Right with
moving
you,
on
Andrew.
to number 4. Fourth strange thing. Corporate criminals, their accomplices, at least their financial accomplices, are totally safe. This strange thing is based on a forthcoming article of mine, Criminal Investors. And to maybe situate it for the viewers, I'd like to pitch to everybody here a couple of deals. Deal number 1, I have a connection to somebody who can supply me with thousands of pills of Adderall. I need about $50,000 to buy all of these Adderall pills from this source. And I would like the viewers to provide me with that $50,000. If you do so, this is going to be a really good business opportunity because it so happens I have access to college campuses. And I might be able to go onto college campuses and sell these Adderall pills at a real premium. And so I'm going to repay you your $50,000 and I'll split the profits with you 50-50. However, I suggest that you not accept this offer because I'm pretty sure I would be a very unsuccessful drug dealer. I don't think I'd be very good at it. I would be caught pretty quickly, and I would be sure to give you up in an attempt to mitigate my own exposure. So if you accept this deal, you should probably expect a knock on the door at some point. I'll offer you a different deal. I would like you to invest a few $1 million in my new telemedicine startup, because I've identified a gap in the marketplace. There are a lot of people who want Adderall, but clinicians are pretty reluctant to just give prescriptions to anybody who wants Adderall. It's a lawful substance, but you need a prescription. It is a controlled substance after all. So you invest a few $1 million in my telemedicine startup, and I'm going to hire people who have prescribing authority, and they're going to prescribe Adderall to anybody who wants it. Market need satisfied, right? We might distribute far more Adderall pills through my telemedicine startup than we would ever do with my more retail distribution idea. Now, if we move forward with this telemedicine startup, I should probably expect to get a knock on the door at some point from the DEA. I'll probably be indicted for violating the Controlled Substances Act. But you as the investor in my, proper startup company, you're probably safe. You're probably not going to get a knock on the door from the DEA or from federal prosecutors. Now, this idea that we would prosecute investors in businesses that violate the law, that's not something that we generally do. But it's not a fanciful idea. There's a whole category of businesses that are publicly traded in some cases that are criminal. They're totally criminal. Cannabis is federally illegal in the United States. Yet there are a number of cannabis companies that trade publicly. If you look at their risk factors, you'll see risk factors much like the one you see here, though. This is for a company called Green Thumb. It warns that aggressive federal prosecutors might view its shareholders as having aided and abetted violations of federal law by financing cannabis activities. That shouldn't surprise us as a clear statement of law. If you invest in my retail drug distribution business, you're certainly somebody who has obtained accomplice liability or conspiracy liability. This is a corporation, though, where we have a risk factor to shareholders that they could be held liable for aiding and abetting violations of federal law, even that shareholders may be left to defend any criminal charges against them at their own expense, and if convicted, be sent to federal prison. Now, we don't typically think about going to prison as a risk of investment. We might think about all sorts of risks when we invest, but those all relate to losing our investment, not going to prison. But just as a matter of black letter law, this seems to be pretty unremarkable. There's no reason why accomplice or conspiracy, or in some cases, principal liability theories wouldn't apply to investment-related conduct. Sure, corporate law provides for limited liability for investors, but that limited liability doesn't extend to an investor's own conduct, and it seems very dubious that that limited liability would extend to criminal exposure for reasons I talk about in the paper. The limited liability we talk about in the context of corporate law is limited liability against vicarious liability for private style debts. But we don't see prosecution of culpable investors, investors who have the mental state, the requisite mental state to help a criminal offense within a corporation, those who have the requisite intent. Why don't we actually see these cases being brought? Well, I argue in the paper that there's a rhetoric of shareholder innocence that really runs through corporate criminal practice. This is just an excerpt from the DOJ's Justice Manual that talks about the need to mitigate harm in corporate enforcement to blameless investors. I question in the paper whether investors really are so blameless. Certainly, we might imagine that those who provide financing to companies that do immoral or objectionable things in society, even if they're not illegal, might bear some moral responsibility for their activity. This is one of the premises of the ESG movement, for example. Certainly, investors bear financial responsibility, at least indirect financial responsibility. If a company engages in criminal activity and has to pay a big fine, that big fine is indirectly coming out of the pocket of shareholders collectively, so they are financially exposed. And then this paper talks about situations or conditions under which the shareholders, the investors, might actually bear some legal responsibility. I have knowingly provided you with financing to carry out or to scale up or to maintain some illicit activity within a corporation. why wouldn't I be liable, at least on an accomplice or conspiracy theory? Well, in thinking about why a prosecutor does or doesn't, or would want to or wouldn't want to bring a case like this, I talk about in the paper the social benefits and costs of doing so. On one hand, there could be some social benefits. Financial activity can be criminogenic. Investment can be criminogenic. I give you money to start your illicit Adderall telemedicine startup. We're going to violate the Controlled Substances Act a whole lot more. If you don't give me the investment capital I need to get my business off the ground, then the business probably won't be violating the law in the first place. So perhaps if we were to bring cases against culpable investors, we would get better deterrence, better general deterrence against future investors proceeding to write a check to a business that they know is going to break the law. So there might be some benefits there. But the social costs of investor prosecution are also likely to be substantial, because I'm talking about a pretty narrow slice of the investor world, the culpable investor, the investor who knows that they're writing a check for some illicit activity. That probably happens to some degree, but the vast majority of investors, I'm sure everybody on this webinar is an investor either directly or indirectly in something, are non-culpable. They are acting in good faith. They aren't intending or knowing that their investments be used to facilitate any sort of illicit activity. Even if indirectly, sometimes their investments do facilitate illicit activity, they lack the criminal intent for that to occur. So the social cost here is that if we were to pursue the tiny slice of culpable investors, we could create higher ex-ante risk perceptions among all investors, the vast majority of good faith, non-culpable investors. And if we create that ex-ante risk perception, or if we increase that ex-ante risk perception, that I could be subject to a criminal investigation if I invest in this company, we might chill the willingness at the margin of investors to invest, which could have pretty bad implications for capital formation and from that economic activity in society. And so if prosecutors wanted to bring a breakthrough case in this area, I talk about conditions under which that might happen in the paper, but they're going to have to be conditions in which the social benefits really, really outweigh the potential costs. And I talk about in the paper how to do that, although I don't necessarily advocate that prosecutors bring these breakthrough cases, because the sensitivities around the social cost of investor prosecution are pretty high. Okay, so what takeaways might we bring from these four strange things? All of these strange things are focused on distortions between corporate and criminal law. I am thinking about writing a larger work, a book titled 7 Strange Things About Corporate Law. So I've given you a preview of 4 of them about this very phenomenon. And my initial take is that this all points to 2 areas of law that have developed in parallel for different purposes. Corporate law has developed for the primary purpose of facilitating capital formation. Everything else it does, like mitigating agency costs, etc., that's secondary, that's derivative of its primary function of facilitating capital formation. And criminal law has many of its own functions as well, not related to capital formation. We want to discourage misconduct in society. We want to incapacitate deviant behavior, all the different purposes of criminal law. These are 2 areas that mix perhaps as well as oil and water do. And as a result, we see these distortions, which leads to some open questions that I'm still thinking through, to be honest. Does this mean that we need to totally revitalize the field of corporate criminal law to try to deal with some of these distortions, to perhaps make them truer to corporate law, or to perhaps make them truer to criminal law? Because there are many instances that I'm talking about in these 4 papers of corporations being treated, for better or for worse, much differently in the criminal context than individuals would be treated. Or does this perhaps give us an answer, or one answer, to the core question of corporate criminal law, which is, given that corporations can't see, think, feel, do anything except through human agents, why subject the chair that trips you, or why subject the entire community to criminal law sanctions, perhaps when there are other areas of law that could do just as good a job? So these are some open questions, and I look forward to the questions from the webinar participants.
Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate that talk. You have mined insights from corners of corporate criminal liability that I didn't know existed. So really appreciate your comments today. So I think one quick question from the chat. You talked about corporate veil piercing, I think, earlier in your presentation, and that the topic came up again with the criminal liability for investors. Just generally speaking, do you see the corporate veil piercing doctrine used very often or effectively with respect to any of these topics?
The courts, we wouldn't expect to see criminal courts really respect corporate law in this context. We see in the tort context some disregard for the veil when we come to actual participation by an investor or some other principal in whatever the conduct is. And so veil piercing doctrine or limited liability doctrine isn't doing a lot of work in this area, because we're always looking at the exception of you are still subject to liability for your own conduct. And so investment related conduct could be direct conduct. So I don't think it's a protection as a de jure matter, but as a de facto matter, I think the rhetoric of shareholder innocence does find a lot of purchase in the doctrine of limited liability. So I think that the doctrine is rhetorically doing a lot of work in shaping conceptions or behavior in this area that perhaps the doctrine isn't doing as a strict matter of law.
I think one more. I really enjoyed your closing comments, trying to take a big picture view here. And in the spirit of zooming out, we're 20, 30 years almost past Enron, and the idea that corporate criminal liability was a death penalty based on essentially the stigma, the reputational cost. Since Enron, I think corporate criminal liability has become more common. Where is corporate crime now in terms of this stigma concept? The idea that, as you referred to earlier in your talk, the solemn hand of criminal law has been laid upon your brand. Where are we now with respect to the effects of that?
I think the specter of Enron and Arthur Andersen and the corporate death penalty is still in the room, but it is certainly starting to depart. We do see more parent level convictions today. We see perhaps more openness to that, perhaps through more aggressive use of waivers for some of the collateral consequences that we talk about. I do make a case throughout these papers that there's something different about criminal exposure, even if it doesn't kill the parent. There could be some qualitatively different consequences than pure regulatory or private enforcement. But I do think we're seeing prosecutors and the defense bar and the defendant side realize that it is possible to survive even in a regulated industry following a corporate criminal conviction. So I think part of the ghost of Arthur Andersen is, maybe it will never find peace, but I think it's going to haunt us less going forward.
Well said. And I think that should bring us to the end of our presentation here. Thanks again, Andrew, for joining us today. I believe I'll turn it over to Todd to close this out.
Great. Yes, I want to just echo a thanks, Andrew, with lots of questions coming in, particularly about kind of current events topics, either about specific companies. We've got, some white collar, even a corporate pardon, if you've been following the news. This is really atypical. Maybe that'll add to your, one of your next sort of weird things about corporate criminal law. But we want to thank you, all our participants for joining us. I just want to make a quick note that on April 24th, we'll have our final installment of our speaker series with Allison Taylor, and she'll be talking about her book, Higher Ground. But until then, thanks all for joining us, and thank you, Andrew, for a great talk.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.